There's a question that critics of the Bible have been using for centuries like a silver bullet, and it's this. Moses was born around 1393 BC. The creation, according to the Bible itself, happened thousands of years before that. Noah's flood, thousands of years before. Abraham, over 400 years before. The patriarchs, the centuries of slavery in Egypt, all of that happened before Moses ever set foot in this world. So the question is unavoidable. How did Moses write the book of Genesis? How could he describe the creation of the world with such precision if he wasn't there? How did he know the names of Adam and Eve, the conversations they had with God, what happened in the Garden of Eden? How did he know the details of Noah's Ark, the exact measurements, the materials, the specific instructions God gave? How could he narrate the lives of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph with that kind of intimacy, with those private conversations, with those moments that had no witnesses? There are only three possible answers, and each one of them, when you look at it closely, completely changes the way you read the Bible. Today, we're going to go through them one by one. We're going to look at the original Hebrew texts. We're going to see what archaeology says. And by the end, you'll understand not just how Moses wrote Genesis, but why that matters for your life today. Stay with me, because what comes next is something very few people know. Before we get to the answers, I need you to understand the scale of the problem, because if you don't understand it, you won't be able to appreciate the solution. Genesis is not a small book. It's 50 chapters, 1,533 verses. It covers a span of time that the Bible's own calculations place at several thousand years, from the creation of the universe to the death of Joseph in Egypt. And it's not just long. It's specific, detailed specific. Genesis 6:15 gives you the exact measurements of the ark, 300 cubits long, 50 wide, 30 high. Genesis 2:11 mentions the name of the Pishon River and says it wound through the whole land of Havilah, where there was gold, good gold, and where there was also bdellium and onyx. Why would a writer invent those details? What's the point of mentioning bdellium and onyx if the whole thing is fiction? Genesis 18 records a private conversation between God and Abraham about the destruction of Sodom. There are no human witnesses. It's just God and Abraham under a tree in Mamre. And yet the text captures every turn of that conversation, every nuance. Abraham bargaining and interceding for the righteous. God patiently responding to each request. Where did that come from? And there's something else that critics don't mention when they ask how Moses knew. Genesis doesn't just talk about spectacular events. It talks about emotions. It talks about Rachel being barren and how deeply that hurt her. It talks about Jacob loving Joseph more than his other sons. It talks about Joseph's brothers feeling envy and how that envy led them to sell him as a slave. It talks about Joseph weeping when he was reunited with Benjamin and having to run out of the room so no one would see him cry. Those emotional details aren't invented, they were remembered or revealed. Now let's get into the three answers. The first is the most straightforward, and it's the one that Jewish and Christian tradition has defended for more than 3,000 years. God revealed it directly to Moses. Before you say, that's just a faith-based answer that can't be verified, hear me out. Because there's textual evidence inside the Bible itself that explains exactly how that revelation worked. Numbers 12, 6-8. God himself speaks about Moses and says something extraordinary. He says, "When there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, reveal myself to them in visions. I speak to them in dreams. But this is not true of my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. With him I speak face to face clearly and not in riddles." Face to face clearly, not in riddles. That is a classification. God is saying that Moses had a level of access to divine revelation that was different from any other prophet. The other prophets received visions, dreams, figures. Moses received direct communication. Exodus 33:11 confirms this. The Lord would speak to Moses face to face as one speaks to a friend. Now think about what that means for Genesis. If Moses had direct communication with God, then God could have revealed to him the events of the creation the same way he revealed the instructions for the tabernacle, the same way he revealed the laws of Leviticus, the same way he revealed the design details of the Ark of the Covenant. Exodus 25 is a perfect example. God tells Moses, "Make this tabernacle and all its furnishings exactly like the pattern I will show you." And then he gives him specific measurements, specific materials, exact proportions. Moses wasn't in heaven when the tabernacle was designed, but God showed it to him. Why would the creation be any different? The theologian Oswald Chambers captured this idea well in his reflections on prophecy. Revelation doesn't work like God whispering secrets. It works by giving the prophet the ability to see what has always been there, what any human eye without that capacity simply cannot perceive. Moses, according to the Bible, had that capacity in an exceptional way, and there's a signal in the text of Genesis itself that points toward direct revelation. It's in chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In Hebrew, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. The structure of that sentence is unusual. In classical Hebrew, when the verb precedes the subject in this kind of sentence, it communicates emphasis on the action. Not simply that God created, but that the creation itself is what defines the beginning. It's a massive theological distinction that an ordinary copyist or compiler wouldn't invent. But there are more linguistic signals in the text pointing to a supernatural or very ancient source. In Genesis 1, the Hebrew word used for created in verse 1 is bara, and this word is fascinating. Throughout the entire Old Testament, bara is used exclusively with God as the subject. No human being ever baras something. No angel ever baras something. Only God. Hebrew linguists point out that this exclusivity is not accidental. It's a deliberate semantic restriction that the author applied with perfect consistency throughout all of Genesis. If the text were a late compilation from multiple sources with multiple authors, it would be virtually impossible for that semantic consistency to hold without an editor of extraordinary skill. But if the text comes from a single source under divine inspiration, the consistency has a simple explanation. Also in Genesis 1, the phrase, "And there was evening and there was morning," repeats at the end of each day of creation. In Hebrew, Vayehi erev, Vayehi voker. This structure, evening first, then morning, seems backwards to us, but it reflects the Hebrew calendar, where the day begins at sundown, just as it's observed today in the Jewish Sabbath. It's a culturally specific marker that indicates the text was written within the Hebrew tradition, not adapted from another culture. But there's more, because the first answer, powerful as it is, isn't the only one. If you're getting something out of this video, hit the like button. It helps more people find this content. The second answer comes from something that seems impossible until you do the math. Oral tradition, direct transmission from eyewitnesses to their descendants, generation by generation, all the way to Moses. And when I say direct, I mean it literally. This is the piece of information that will change the way you look at the genealogies in Genesis. Adam lived 930 years, Genesis 5:5. Methuselah lived 969 years, the longest-lived man in biblical history. Shem, Noah's son, lived 600 years. And Shem, according to the biblical chronology's calculations, outlived Abraham. Do you understand what that means? Abraham could have personally known Shem. He could have asked him directly about the flood, about Noah, about the times before the flood. But the math gets even more impressive. A detailed analysis of the biblical genealogies shows something very few people have noticed. If we take the patriarchs' ages exactly as they appear in the text, the information could have traveled from Adam to Moses through very few direct links. The first is Methuselah. According to the calculations in the biblical text, Methuselah was born while Adam was still alive, and the two coexisted for 243 years. 243 years in which Methuselah could have heard firsthand from Adam's own mouth what had happened in the Garden of Eden. The second link is Shem, Noah's son. Methuselah died the year of the flood, but Shem lived 600 years and reached the time of the patriarchs. The text's calculations show that Shem outlived Abraham by about 25 years. Think about that. Shem, who was on the ark with Noah, who heard from his father the stories of the world before the flood, lived long enough to know Abraham. The third link is Abraham himself. Abraham knew Shem, and Abraham was the grandfather of Jacob, whose son Levi lived in Egypt. The fourth link is Kohath, son of Levi, who according to Exodus 6:16-18 was the grandfather of Moses. The fifth link is Amram, Moses' father, the man who raised the author of Genesis, 5 people. An unbroken chain of transmission from the direct eyewitness to the creation all the way to the man who wrote it down. And I want you to stop for a moment and think about something. Today, most of us have access to our grandparents, and in many cases our great-grandparents. A grandfather born in the 1920s lived through World War II, the rise of communism, the moon landing. If that grandfather tells you those stories in detail, you'll remember them accurately for the rest of your life, and you'll be able to pass them on. Now imagine that grandfather didn't live 100 years, but 900. That he witnessed entire centuries of human history, that he knew people who saw the beginning of everything. Oral tradition in ancient cultures wasn't the broken telephone game we imagine today. It was a highly structured system, ritually repeated, verified by the community, transmitted with deliberate precision. Cultures without writing developed extraordinary memories precisely because oral transmission was the only way to preserve what mattered. In ancient Hebrew culture, memorizing genealogies and historical accounts wasn't optional, it was central, and the patriarchs of Genesis weren't illiterate cave dwellers. Abraham left Ur of the Chaldeans, one of the most advanced cities of the ancient world, with temples, cuneiform writing, and scribal schools. Oral tradition in that context wasn't primitive, it was sophisticated. But I want you to stop for a moment on something that often gets overlooked in this analysis. Oral tradition wasn't just telling stories. In the ancient Hebrew world, there was a practice called the zikaron, which means memorial, active remembrance. It wasn't simply recalling an event, it was reproducing it, reliving it, re-experiencing it as a community. Every time a Hebrew family told the story of Abraham, they weren't doing it like bedtime storytelling. They were doing it as an act of collective identity. These are the stories that explain who we are, where we come from, why we exist. And there's something else. The Hebrews had a figure in the community called the Zaken, the elder, whose primary role wasn't administrative. It was memorial. His responsibility was to guard and transmit the ancestors' stories with precision. It wasn't a minor role, it was one of the most respected positions in the community. When Jacob gathered his 12 sons in Genesis 49 to give them his final blessing, what he was doing was a formal act of transmission. He was handing each son the narrative of their place in God's family. That wasn't forgotten. It was repeated. It was taught to children's children. Now imagine that during 400 years of slavery in Egypt, the Pharaoh could take away the Hebrew people's freedom. He could force them to build pyramids. He could kill their sons, but he couldn't take away their stories. The stories of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph survived on the lips of mothers and sons in the slave camps of the Nile. They survived because those stories were the only thing they had left. and because those stories promised that it wouldn't always be like this. That is what Moses heard as a child. That is what he carried in his memory when God called him from the burning bush. But the third answer is the one that hits me hardest. And it's the one encoded in the text of Genesis itself, in Hebrew, waiting for someone to notice it. There's a phrase that appears 11 times in the book of Genesis. 11 times. In Hebrew it's Ele Toledot. In English it's generally translated as, "These are the generations of," or "This is the book of the generations of." Genesis 2:4. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth. Genesis 5:1. This is the book of the generations of Adam. Genesis 6:9. These are the generations of Noah. Genesis 10:1. These are the generations of the sons of Noah. Genesis 11:10. These are the generations of Shem. And so on throughout the book. 11 times, always structuring the book into clearly defined sections. What does that mean? In 1936, a British officer named P.J. Wiseman, who had traveled extensively through the archaeological sites of Babylon and Mesopotamia, published a fascinating theory. Studying thousands of ancient cuneiform tablets, he noticed something. Those tablets always closed with a phrase at the end, not the beginning. That phrase was called a colophon, and it indicated the name of the author or owner of the document. It was the signature that certified the content. Wiseman proposed that the Toledot phrases in Genesis function exactly like those Mesopotamian colophons. If he's right, they wouldn't be introducing what comes next, but closing what came before, signing it with the name of the responsible party. When Genesis 5:1 says, "This is the book of the generations of Adam," it's not saying now we're going to talk about Adam. It's closing the preceding record with its signature. This document belongs to Adam's archive. And Genesis 37:2 says, "These are the generations of Jacob," closing Jacob's historical record before Joseph's story begins. Wiseman's theory doesn't have academic consensus, and there are legitimate debates about whether the Toledot function exactly like the Babylonian colophons. But what no one can deny is that the pattern exists, that it's consistent, and that it fits perfectly with the documentary practices of the world in which the patriarchs lived. Scholar R.K. Harrison of Trinity College wrote in 1969 that Wiseman's approach has the distinct advantage of relating the ancient Mesopotamian sources underlying Genesis to an authentic Mesopotamian life situation, unlike the attempts of the critical school. Moses, under this interpretation, wasn't simply a recipient of revelation. He was also an archivist, an editor under divine inspiration who took historical records that had survived for centuries, unified them under God's guidance, and presented them as the book we know today. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this. This is exactly the kind of information that strengthens faith when the hard questions come. Now, someone might ask, but doesn't modern biblical criticism say that Genesis was written by multiple authors in much later times? That's a legitimate question, and it deserves an honest answer. Starting in the 18th century, a group of scholars developed what's called the documentary hypothesis, or the JEDP theory. The idea was that the Pentateuch, including Genesis, wasn't written by Moses, but was compiled from 4 distinct sources: the Yahwist document, the Elohist, the Deuteronomist, and the priestly source. Each would have been written in different periods, centuries after Moses, and then merged by a later editor. Why did they propose this? Mainly for 2 reasons. First, the text of Genesis uses 2 different names for God. Some passages say Elohim, the generic name for God. Others say YWH, God's personal name. The critics said those differences indicated 2 distinct authors with 2 distinct theologies. Second reason, there are apparent repetitions in the text. The flood seems to be told twice with slight differences. The story of Abraham saying Sarah was his sister appears in 2 versions. The critics interpreted those repetitions as evidence of merged sources. What does the evidence say against this? First, the use of 2 names for God. In ancient Hebrew linguistics, using different names for the same deity within the same text was completely normal and had theological purpose. Elohim emphasizes God's transcendence and creative power. AHWH emphasizes the personal relationship, the covenant, faithfulness. Authors switched between the 2 names deliberately depending on the emphasis they wanted. This is observed in texts from known single authors. It's not a sign of multiple authorship. Second, the apparent repetitions. In ancient Hebrew literature, repetition with variation was a deliberate literary device called parallelismus membrorum. It wasn't an editorial error. It was a style. The same thing appears in the Psalms, in Proverbs, in the prophets. Third, and this is perhaps most important, the Dead Sea Scrolls. In 1947, in the caves of Qumran, manuscripts of the Old Testament were discovered that were more than 2,000 years old. They included fragments of every book of the Old Testament except one. And what they showed was that the text of Genesis we have today is essentially identical to those manuscripts from 2,000 years ago, without the divisions by sources that the documentary hypothesis predicted, without the seams between a J document and an E document. The text was integrated, a detail that very few people mention. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls were several scrolls with the book of Genesis in Aramaic, which scholars call the Genesis Apocryphon. This text from the 1st century BC doesn't reflect a late reconstructed Genesis. It reflects the same text we know, with the same structure, the same sections, the same Toledot markers. If Genesis had been edited and compiled from separate sources in the 5th or 6th century BC, as the theory proposed, traces of that process would have remained in the oldest manuscripts. They don't exist. Furthermore, critics of the JEDP theory point out something the theory's originators couldn't have known. In the 20th century, archaeology began discovering texts from the ancient Near East that had exactly the characteristics the documentary hypothesis attributed to signs of late editing. And those texts dated to the 2nd millennium BC, to Moses' time, not to later periods. What appeared to be an editorial flaw turned out to be a completely normal literary style for Moses' era. Now I want you to connect everything we've seen, because here's the full picture. Moses was the most prepared person in the history of Israel to write Genesis. I don't say that as an exaggeration, I say it as a historical assessment. Acts 7:22 says Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. He was educated in the court of Pharaoh. He had access to the best scribal schools of the ancient world. He knew hieroglyphic writing, probably cuneiform, and had access to Egypt's great libraries. The Egyptians were obsessive about historical records. The Hebrews, who had lived in Egypt for more than 4 centuries, had coexisted with that archival culture. The genealogies, the family records, the stories of the patriarchs would have been preserved with the same care the Egyptians used for their royal records. When Moses left Egypt with the people of Israel, he didn't leave only with people. He left with the collective memory of a people that had guarded its stories for generations. And after that, during 40 years in the desert, Moses had something no other ancient writer had: direct access to God's presence in the tabernacle. I want you to stop and think about those 40 years in the desert, because most people see them as a waiting period, almost a punishment, dead time in the history of Israel. It wasn't. It was the most productive writing period in ancient history. During those 40 years, Moses wrote Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That's more than 180 chapters, more than 5,700 verses. written in the desert, without libraries, without scribes at his service, without the comforts of the Pharaoh's palace where he grew up. How did he do it? Exodus 25:22 says, God would speak to Moses from above the mercy seat between the cherubim. It was the most sacred meeting place in ancient Israel, the place where God's presence dwelt in a special way. It was there that Moses received the instructions for Leviticus. It was there that he received the details of the priesthood, the laws of Deuteronomy, and very probably it was there that the traditions and documents he carried were ordered under divine inspiration into what we know today as the book of Genesis. It wasn't revelation without history. It wasn't history without revelation. It was both together. The records written by the patriarchs, transmitted orally from generation to generation, preserved with the fidelity that only a highly trained oral culture can achieve, and then confirmed, completed and organized under God's direct guidance in the person of Moses. That is the Genesis we have. And now comes the part that matters most to me of everything we've talked about. Why does this matter today? Because the question of how Moses wrote Genesis isn't just an academic question. It's a question that affects how you read every single verse in that book. If Genesis is a late compilation of invented myths, then the creation doesn't matter, the flood doesn't matter, Abraham doesn't matter. They're nice stories, but there's nothing on which to ground your faith. But if Genesis is what the evidence suggests it is, a text that combines real historical records, oral transmission verified over centuries, and direct divine revelation, then every detail matters. The ark's measurements matter, Rachel's emotions matter, Jacob's late-night conversations matter, Abraham bargaining with God for the souls of Sodom matters. They aren't literary decorations, they are windows into real events. Romans 15:4 says, everything that was written in the past was written to teach us, so that through the endurance taught in the scriptures and the encouragement they provide, we might have hope. Well, Paul was talking about the Old Testament. He was talking about Genesis, written to teach us, written to teach you. That means the stories of Genesis aren't there just to satisfy your historical curiosity. They're there because they have something to say directly to you in this moment of your life. The story of Noah isn't just about the flood. It's about what happens when a person decides to obey God in a world that mocks that obedience. It's the story of your life every time you choose to do the right thing when no one around you does. The story of Abraham leaving everything to follow God toward a land he didn't know isn't just archaeology. It's the map of what it feels like when God asks you to let go of what you have to receive what he has for you. The story of Joseph, sold by his own brothers, going from dreams to the pit, from the pit to prison, from prison to the palace, isn't just a story of resilience. It's the most concrete promise in the Bible that God doesn't waste the suffering of those who trust him. Genesis 50:20. Joseph tells his brothers, who betrayed him, who sold him into slavery, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." Moses wrote that line, and Moses knew what he was talking about. Because Moses spent 40 years in the desert of Midian, exiled after fleeing Egypt, maybe thinking his story was over, until God appeared in a burning bush and told him his story was just beginning. Moses didn't write Genesis as an academic writing a treatise. He wrote it as someone who had lived its truths. And that's why when you read Genesis, you're not reading an irrelevant ancient text. You're reading the story of how the God who created the universe has been involved in human history from the very first moment. And if he's been involved from the first moment, he's also involved in yours. That's what Genesis has to say to you today. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Every week there are videos like this one, and you won't want to miss what's coming. There's one last thing I want to leave you with before we finish. When Jesus' disciples asked him about the scriptures, he didn't send them to commentators or academic critics. He sent them directly to the text. Luke 24:27 says that beginning with Moses, Jesus explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. Beginning with Moses, beginning with Genesis. Jesus himself validated the Mosaic authorship of Genesis. In John 5:46, he told the religious leaders of his time, "If you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me." Moses wrote about Jesus in Genesis, and Jesus said that whoever doesn't understand what Moses wrote cannot understand him. That gives Genesis a dimension that goes far beyond history or archaeology. Genesis isn't just the first book of the Bible. It's the book that lays the foundation for everything that comes after. Without Genesis, there's no promise to Abraham. Without the promise to Abraham, there's no Israel. Without Israel, there are no prophets. Without the prophets, there's no preparation for the Messiah. Without the Messiah, there's no gospel. And without Moses, the man God prepared with the education of the Egyptians, equipped with the memory of a people, and visited face to face in the desert, that book wouldn't exist in the form we have it. That's not coincidence. That's providence. The same providence that pulled a Hebrew baby from the waters of the Nile and brought him to Pharaoh's palace, precisely so, he would have access to the best education of the ancient world. The same providence that sent him to the desert of Midian for 40 years, where he learned every path, every water source, every rock of the territory through which he would later guide 1 million people. The same providence that found him in front of a burning bush that wasn't consumed and told him everything you've lived until now was preparation. Now your real mission begins. Moses wrote Genesis without having been at the creation because God doesn't need you to have been somewhere to testify about it. He needs you to be available, to be prepared, to be willing to listen and write what he shows you. Everything that existed before you has something to say to you. That's what Genesis teaches, and that's what Moses understood. If this video made you think, if it gave you something new to consider, I invite you to watch the video that's on screen right now. It's one that perfectly complements what we just talked about and will take you even deeper. See you